What you're touching on here is that the incredible success of your first book, both a blessing and a curse.
Yeah,
bit, right?
Definitely.
Which is interesting to think about. People don't necessarily think about that way.
No, and I think if I were a different writer, I might not think about it that way. But and we talked a little bit about this the other day. There's a weird thing that happens in publishing, and particularly now, where we're in this age of kind of extreme nichification, where we don't just have genres, but we have these infinite subgenres that have very specific kind of rubrics for what fits into that genre. And it's created a literary landscape in which people can buy books based on tropes. They can buy books based on things they already know that they like. And there's something to be said for the comfort of, like, you know, you buy a sci-fi book, you go into that with certain expectations. And if you don't meet some of those expectations, your readers are going to be mad. Like, does what it says on the tin is generally good advice for shelf marks with books. But there are a lot of books that don't fit specifically into one of those neat little categories. Like, a constant frustration I have is retailers always want to put my books in the mystery section, and I don't think they belong there. It's like, oh yeah, well, there's like some things that you need to figure out, so that makes it a mystery. And I'm like, no, it really doesn't. And the reason I don't like that is because it sets people up with the wrong expectations. If they go into it expecting a mystery or a thriller and that's not actually what it is, you're setting people up to hate the book just because it's not what they thought they were getting. But I think there's also a lot to be said for reading outside of your comfort zone and reading outside of the genre or the subgenre or the tropes even that you already know that you like. Because otherwise you limit yourself as both like a reader and an artist and a person. And I never thought of myself as a genre writer. I always wanted to play with a bunch of different genres and kind of make them all my own. And that's increasingly hard to do in not just publishing, but the entertainment landscape that we're in. If a publisher can't figure out, you know, what are the genre tags that we use on Instagram, what that says to them is this is going to be a hard book to sell.
Right. It needs to be like nothing like it in the world, but it's a lot like this.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
You want them to be surprised, but not too surprised.
Right.
You know, just surprised enough.
Right. And so part of the reason it took me like 10 years to get this book out in the world is that, well, there's kind of two parts to that story. One of which is that when Villains first came out, nobody bought it, nobody read it, it fell off a cliff, and my publisher was like, we would not like to hear from you. Which happens to a lot of books. They just sort of like disappear into the dustbin of literary history. And for a long time, I couldn't sell any books after that just because the sales numbers were not good and nobody wanted to take a chance on a writer who had not proved that they had an audience. That sort of changed about 3 years after Villains had come out. And by that point, when everybody suddenly was like, where is the next novel? The problem was they just wanted Villains Part 2. They just wanted more of what was already working because publishing loves a sure thing. And that wasn't what I wanted to do. So getting this book out in the world was really an uphill battle.
But worth it.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a remarkable book.
Thank you.
It isn't Villains, and thank God. I mean, it's just its own thing. No, I mean, I think that repeating yourself is you know, you could get away with it.
And some writers certainly have.
Yeah. It's not a lot of fun for the writer, I wouldn't think.
No, especially because I published Villains when I was so young.
Yeah.
So young. What I sometimes tell people, I actually wrote it while I was here in college, my senior year of college. I was writing Villains. I was 22. And listen, there's a lot of daylight between 22 and 34. You change a lot as a person. I had a lot more life experience, and I'm just a much better writer than I was at that age. And looking back at Villains, what I always tell people is, for me, it's a little bit like looking at photos of myself from high school. It's like equal parts cringe and nostalgia. There's the nostalgia for like, oh, when I was 18 and I could have lived on a diet of champagne and battery acid and been fine, but also like, God, who cut my hair like that? So yeah, it's a bit, there's some growing pains involved. But I am actually kind of grateful for that time because I think part of the reason we couldn't sell this book in the beginning was the sales numbers, of course, but also I don't think I was a good enough writer to write it when I first tried to write it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No more now.
Yeah.
And it shows. It was done every level, from the sentence level, the chapter to the characterizations, settings. It's a huge palette. It encompasses the country. It really, really moves. For those who don't know what Hot Wax is about, maybe we should tell them.
Yeah, we probably should do that. This is the thing that happens when you do book events with people that you know, and poor Daniel has been stuck up here with me 3 times now. You forget that everyone in the room hasn't read the book, and you're like off to the races, and you're like, these people have no idea what we're talking about. So I pitched this book to my agent as This Is Spinal Tap meets Thelma and Louise, which, crickets, everybody's too young for that. But to give you kind of the short summary of it is it takes place on 2 parallel timelines. Like a record, it has an A side and a B side. The A side, the main character is 10 years old, and she is on tour with her father's rock band in the summer of 1989, and everything goes terribly, terribly awry. And then in the B-side timeline, it's the same character in her early 40s, and she is on the run from some stuff in her personal life and finds herself kind of retracing the steps of that concert tour 30 years ago.
Boom, that's it. Yeah.
Can you tell I've done this a couple of times now?
And in between the beginning and the end are lifetimes.
Yeah.
On the A side, we have her as a child. In an adult's world and experiencing many of the things that adults do that a child shouldn't, but it's one of those kids on a rock tour. What do you expect? What's the worst that could happen, right? The worst, some of the worst. And then this, as I mentioned the other day too, the trauma of being a child in an adult's world, she carries with her throughout her life and is structurally and also factually within the course of the book at any rate, trying to understand and expunge that. So it's so we get to see her from the beginning of her life really to the beginning of a new life.
Yeah.
And it's such an adventure. The thing about a road trip, a book about a road trip is that there's constant events or things that are always having to happen because you're moving along, you're going to a different place. In this book, we have 2 road trips. So in other words, you have to come up with a lot of stuff to write about. You have to just be really inventive. It is a lot. How did you do that?
Well, honestly, everything that happens in this book is based on something real. Whether it was an experience that I had or an experience that I read about. I'm an academic by trade, not anymore, but I am a very thorough researcher. And my research didn't really start out as research. It started out just as me being a young person who was obsessed with this music and trying to learn everything I possibly could about the world of the people who made it, which was sometimes very upsetting when I was like 13 and way too young to be reading about the shark incident. Look that up if you don't know. I don't want to get into that now. Yeah. Yeah, that sound should tell you everything you need to know. But yeah, much like I did with Villains, with that book, I was at the time very invested in this idea of Shakespearean tragic structure and like how does he build a narrative in that particular way. And trying to figure out if I could do something similar in a novel, like if I were to write my own story that had that same kind of structure, what would that look like? And with Hot Wax, I did something similar, which was after so many years of being really steeped in this music, both as a concert goer, as a record collector, and as a reader, I was thinking about, if I was going to craft my own kind of big bad rock and roll tour, what would that look like? And what are the different kind of themes and events and things I can draw on to kind of build a whole new story?
I noted that when I was reading it, I shared this with you. There's this one big scene in a rock concert where there's a lot of onstage violence.
Yes.
And I had been to a show remarkably similar to that, and I wondered, and if I had, and you had, and obviously in your research studied other instances of that, I wonder how often it actually happened that shows would devolve into this brawl.
Yeah, I mean, it's happened at a couple of shows that I've been at. And like You can find this one online. There's a really interesting video online of a Rolling Stones concert where a fan tried to run on stage and was running right at Mick Jagger, and Keith Richards just takes his guitar and smashes him right in the back of the head with it like a sledgehammer with zero hesitation, and then just kind of like, it's the Rolling Stones, you carry on. And there's all kinds of stories about this sort of stuff happening. Like a bunch of people were trampled to death at a Who concert once upon a time. Altamont, famously, somebody was stabbed, shot, I don't remember, probably both. And part of where this book came from was when I was younger, not when I was younger, when my dad was much younger, he was a concert bouncer in Los Angeles in the late 70s, early 80s, and so he saw some shit. And told me these kinds of wild stories of bouncing like Cal Jam 2 and that kind of thing. And any time you get hundreds or thousands of people, many of whom have consumed all kinds of substances, right, in one place, and then get them really keyed up with this very, very energetic music, like, yeah, stuff's gonna go wrong.
Right, and that makes for a good story.
Totally.
You don't want to write a story where nothing bad happens.
You know, it's funny, like, I actually am writing an article for The Atlantic about this right now. It is very in vogue now to write fiction where nothing happens. Yeah. Like everything we call literary fiction now, it's like, oh, it's less of a novel and more of a vibe. That was the thing I actually read in a review recently that made me like throw up in my mouth a little bit. And it's like, I don't know when this happened, but we developed this idea that having a plot is somehow lowbrow. Yeah, and it's like, sue me. I like a narrative. Yeah. I want something to actually happen.
Yeah. It's amazing how soon, how quickly we become old.
Yeah.
I love a plot. You know? I know. What are the kids these days? They don't do the plots anymore. What do they know?
Yeah.
So you touched on this. You don't come to this story in this book accidentally.
No.
Right? And just like you didn't come to When We're Villains accidentally, you have a history with music and a present with music as well. It's a big part of your life.
It's a huge part of my life, and actually maybe even more so than Shakespeare, which was another early obsession for me. We talked the other day about how every writer is really just a creature of obsession, and that's where a novel comes from, is like you need to do something with that obsession. It's almost like an exorcism in a weird kind of way. It's like, I have to get this out of my system. And it's not like I write a book and then never think about that thing again, but music was always point zero for my writing process. Even with something like Villains, the first thing I do when I'm working on a new project is dump a bunch of music in a playlist that feels like it could be the soundtrack to this book, or just kind of feels like the mood, the tone, the feeling that I want for a book. Music was kind of the first language I spoke. It was the first form of art that I really latched onto and really felt like a safe space for me. So writing a novel in that world was sort of only natural, but as I got older and kind of stayed more on the scene in different ways, as soon as I was old enough to get myself to shows, I was going to shows as often as I could. I had an embarrassing incident when I was in graduate school where I had accidentally booked myself concert tickets for 6 nights in a row, and my bank thought it was fraud and canceled my credit card. And I then had to call the bank and explain to them, yes, I did buy concert tickets for 6 nights in a row. Because part of it was that none of my friends wanted to go to the shows that I was going to, because the music that I like is so off trend, and most of it's quite old by now. So I got really used to just going to concerts by myself because it was the stuff I wanted to see, and you know, all the strangers in the room who are there for the same reason you are become your best friends for 2 hours, and then you never see them again. And when I was in my mid-20s, I got a job with a music magazine called The Vinyl District, where I was doing a lot of reviews and artist interviews. I was on the road with artists sometimes, and I just got a whole different perspective on the business and the experience of being specifically a touring musician. So that was something that I felt much like Villains. It was a world that I knew very well and had never seen it represented on the page in a way that felt convincing and persuasive to me. And I have found a couple of books since then that I'm like, oh yeah, this person gets it. For the music scene, one I would say is, if you have not read John Ray's book, Gone to the Wolves, it's incredible. It's all about death metal. It's one of the best books. It's one of the best music novels I've ever read. But I kind of just went, yeah, okay, maybe you're the person who has to write that book.
Right.
Because it kind of doesn't exist.
Right. That's, they say if you want to see you write a book that you want to see on the shelf. That there's that space there that is not occupied yet.
Yeah, and it's kind of like you have to have this faith in it of like if you build it, they will come. You have to write a book that you would want to read and hope that there are other readers out in the world who want to read that book too.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and then you can't help but write about your obsessions.
Yeah.
Anything else will just be very thin gruel.
Yeah.
I think. Could you do something on? Have people pitched you ideas to write? Like, why don't you write this book or this book?
Yeah, I mean, we actually got a lot of that when we were submitting with Hot Wax. We got a lot of editors saying to us, but can't it just be more like If We Were Villains? Can't it just be more like that? And I was like, no, it's a completely different book. And because a novel is such a huge undertaking, it's going to take, 2-3 years minimum to write a novel and get it out in the world just because publishing is a very slow business. You have to be fully obsessed with it or you're going to be miserable on month 5. So I would have a really hard time writing a book about something I wasn't deeply, deeply fascinated by. And that's actually my favorite thing about the writing process is it's an excuse for me to go really, really deep on something that I love.
Right.
In a way that I've only ever done in an academic environment outside of writing. But the writing is totally self-directed, which is where the joy comes in.
Right. It's up to you to do this. Nobody really cares as much as you do.
No one's making you do this. And the thing about the publishing business, kind of like rock and roll, is way more people want to be published authors than the market can possibly support. It's a really competitive business. So nobody's holding their breath waiting for your book because there's 9,000 other people who have books they want to publish.
Exactly.
So you have to kind of really have not just an obsession, but sort of a demented obsession that this thing has to exist.
Is there a relationship between the music world and the publishing world? Because I don't know, I'm not familiar with it, because they're obviously musicians who are out there knocking on doors as well and are having as much success as many young writers do. It's very difficult to break in, but the music business is that there are lots of little doors you can go through until you go to the big ones.
It actually is very comparable in a lot of ways. Much like in publishing, you have the big 5 trad publishing, and then you have indie publishing. This is not like a value judgment. It's just about size, the hand gestures that I'm making, because I'm Italian, can you tell? So you have the trad publishers, and then you have indie publishers, you have small press, micro press, and then you have self-publishing. And those are all, there's different fits for different people. It used to be that there was a real stigma around self-publishing, that was for losers who couldn't get published the real way. Thankfully, that opinion is losing ground a little bit because self-publishing has actually proven to be much more lucrative for certain kinds of writers, particularly people who do genre fiction, like anything you're going to read really, really fast, like romance or hard sci-fi, westerns, because those readers tend to buy books in bulk and read them really quickly and usually on an e-reader. They don't buy a lot of physical books because they read them so fast. And if you're a writer of romance or westerns, that's probably a better lane for you because you're going to get to take all that money home and you don't have to wait 2 years to put a book out and give 20% to an agent and take a little tiny piece of the royalties. And the music business is kind of similar. You have this massive divide that is only widening in the age of streaming between the haves and the have-nots. You have your Taylor Swifts and your Beyoncés, and then you have tiny little musicians who are making their own kind of DIY CDs in their backyard and selling them at farmers markets and that kind of thing. And then there's this whole kind of squishy strata in the middle of artists who are either on independent labels or starting their own labels because that's the only way they can kind of break into the business. And if you are mostly a live performing band, that's totally different from artists who are mostly they don't tour or perform at all and they just kind of put out CDs and records. So there's a lot of different ways to do it. I think actually the biggest difference between publishing and the music business is paperwork. Not until I started working closely with musicians did I realize how much in the music business is still a handshake arrangement. Where I had an artist friend of mine who went through this really awful breakup with his manager a couple years back. And I was and I finally said, well, what does it say in your contract? And he said, well, we don't have a contract. Wow. And I was like, I'm sorry, excuse me? You do not have a contract with your manager for how much they get, like, do they get a commission, how much they get paid, like, and he was like, no, it's just a handshake arrangement that we did like 5 years ago. And I was like, that, I'm gonna have nightmares just thinking about that, because publishing, like everything we do, has a contract that's 40 pages long and takes lawyers 6 weeks to vet, which is its own kind of hell, but at least you kind of know where you stand.
Yeah, that's crazy.
Yeah, I was like, that is crazy. I have since talked him into putting things on paper. I was like, this is going to make your life so much easier. But yeah, that was really interesting that as much as music is modernized, it's still very old-fashioned in the way that it works.
Yeah. In this book, there's so many, again, so many remarkable scenes, and some of them violent, some of them just emotionally riveting, and some just very heartrending, because in the course of a book of this expansiveness, you really do get to close to the characters, and they become, you worry about them. You worry about a lot of the characters in this book because they're in the music world. It's very, very dangerous kids. And I'm wondering, I know that you probably had the same feeling about your characters after a while. You were with them for a really long time.
Yeah.
Was it hard to cause them such grief?
Oh, yeah. I mean, they say kill your darlings about the editing process, and I say that torture your darlings is really kind of like the bread and butter of good fiction. And it's funny, you live with characters that, I think if you're going to write really good fiction, the characters have to be very real to you. I've often referred to my characters as my imaginary friends, because you live with them for so long that they do become very real. And yeah, it always hurts to do bad things to people you love. But I think what's actually even more painful, particularly with this book, is watching these people that you care about make absolutely terrible choices over and over and over and over again. And
surprise you by how bad their choices are.
Yeah, it's like, you think that was bad, just wait, I can do something worse.
So what kind of are you the marionette master here, or how's that work in your process of writing?
It's I'm what we call in the industry an upmarket writer, and I wish that more people outside the industry knew that term. Basically what upmarket means is that you're kind of straddling this line between commercial fiction and literary fiction. You're straddling a line between really plot-driven and really character-driven. So I'm a thorough outliner, which is very not rock and roll. I like to have a narrative arc that I know what I'm doing before I sit down to write. So I always go into a novel project with a sense of like where I think the story is going and what I think the characters are going to do. But they always surprise me. There are always moments where characters kind of hijack the story and go, I don't want to do that, I want to do this. And I've learned over the years that fighting that usually doesn't work. Right. Like, if a character wants to do something different than what you're trying to make them do, that's usually a good thing to kind of listen to, because that usually comes from a deep place of truth, and it might just take you a while to figure out what that is. And for me, that's the revision process. I think this is kind of unusual because I've never spoken to another writer who said this, and they all look at me like I have 3 heads when I talk about it. But revision is actually my favorite part of the process. Yeah. The first draft is my least favorite part of the process. It's just kind of like this is what I think the story is. And then revision is where I actually figure out what I'm really talking about. It's where I figure out what I'm really talking about. It's where I figure out what the story is really about. It's where I figure out which themes actually matter and need to be brought to the surface, and which things can kind of maybe be left on the cutting room floor. So there's always a lot of evolution with a book, especially when you work on it for this long.
Yeah. Did you ever start hating your book?
Actually, not this book.
Yeah.
I've hated most of my books at some point in time. And sometimes it's circumstantial. I hated Villains for a long time because it looked like it was going to be the end of my career when I thought it was going to be the beginning. And that was really tough. And it was funny. Like, I had actually tricked myself into thinking it was a much worse book than it is, because I got into my head about like, well, it must just be a terrible book, and that's why nobody wants to buy it. Because I was also just too young to really understand how the publishing industry cannibalizes its own. Had I known that, I maybe would have had less angst about it. Graveyard Shift I only hated for about 5 minutes because I ended up having to write the first draft of that in like 3 weeks, and that was again a circumstantial thing. Hot wax I never hated. I carried a torch for this book for a long time. There were moments that I hated. There was a draft that tried to kill me twice. That was draft 6 that I did in a house that we ended up calling draft 666. But that again was very circumstantial. It was like I had done. There was one really massive change that my editor that we needed to make, which I can't really explain without getting into some real spoilers. But my editor said, "I think we need to change something major in this part of the story. Up to you how you want to do it." And it ended up being that I had to cut like 40,000 words of material and then write 60,000 words of brand new material in a space of like 4 weeks. That was not great. I didn't love that. And then in the middle of that, my computer just started crashing repeatedly and I was constantly losing work and losing my mind at the same time. So that was not my favorite thing. But no, I never hated this book. And maybe that day will come. Like maybe something awful will happen with it that I will end up hating this book. I really hope not. But so far, no. It's like even though I've been chipping away at it for like a third of my life, it's been...
A third of your life? Isn't that remarkable to think about?
Yeah.
It makes the whole writing process seem a bit different than we're led to believe.
Yeah, it's not a business for impatient people.
It's true. I need to be more patient.
Yeah, well, and that's something I worry about with young writers. Like, I see a lot of rushing in young writers. Like, we have such a youth-obsessed culture that it's this idea that, oh my God, I have to have a book out and hit the New York Times bestseller list by the time I'm old enough to rent a car. And I want to just be like, baby, no. No. Publishing is a slow business by design. It's a feature, not a bug. It takes time to make good fiction.
Yeah.
And I wish that I had known that when I was younger and not been in such a rush to publish my first novel. And I wish I'd been a little bit older when it had come out. And so, yeah, I actually really relish working on this book.
But you don't regret writing that first book. I mean, that was a great book. I mean, have you reread it?
So this is sort of a funny story. When the book did finally take off and find its audience, it had been years since it had come out and even longer since I'd actually read it because... You know, by the time a book comes out, you've been done working on it for some months, and probably you're working on the next thing if you want to stay sane. And I finally was going to go do like a book event for Villains for like the first time. I did a couple of little tiny book events that were like hyper local when that book came out, and it took off in the UK in a way that it really didn't here early on. And they decided to do this like fancy 5th anniversary edition, and they said like, well, how about you come over and we'll do like a couple of events? And I said, amazing. So smash cut to the night before this big giant event I'm doing at like Waterstones Piccadilly, which feels like a dream come true. And suddenly I realized that I haven't read this book in 7 years and I'm supposed to go talk about it tomorrow. So I was like staying in this crappy hotel in Waterloo, and the only place open was like a tapas bar around the corner. So it's like 11:30 at night. I'm like desperately drinking wine and housing olives. I'm like speed reading this book. And the waitress came over and she said, wow, you seem like you're so intensely invested in that. What are you reading? And I was like, excuse me while I die of embarrassment. And I think I lied. I don't think I told her I was reading my own book. But it was funny. It was funny because I did have this moment of being like, this doesn't suck nearly as much as I convinced myself it did.
Yeah.
So I can look back on it now and give my young self a lot of credit for having a lot of gumption to try and make that happen when she was an infant.
Right. And the highest praise that a writer can give their own work sometimes is, it doesn't suck as much as I thought it would.
It's so true.
But I'd love to open up the floor to questions if anybody has any queries for...
Well, and just before we get off to the races with questions, I will say one thing, which is, seems like this is not going to be a problem here, but I used to be a teacher and I like active participation. So in order to encourage questions, I've brought prizes. One of which is we made these really awesome Gill and the Kills concert tour posters. There are only 100 of these. They are signed and numbered. So Daniel and I both signed this. And whoever asks my favorite question tonight will get to take this home.
Oh my God. I have a...
You're wearing a t-shirt. Shh. Yeah, so who's got questions?
Oh man, I didn't realize I was the only one. I had a quick question about like you deciding to write from like a Cuban immigrant's perspective, and as a Mexican American immigrant myself. It was very riveting seeing like him decide. I've read some of the book already. I was trying to finish it beforehand, but
it's a long book. Take your time.
No, it's so good. him being like, hey, I just kind of don't care about them anymore. And like that part of his culture, essentially, like towards the beginning where he's just like, oh, my mom, you know? I feel like for me as a Mexican American immigrant, it was very daunting because from the moment I can remember, like my soul literally eats itself out of guilt sometimes from the family I left behind. Like it's such a strong thing to have.
Yeah.
So it was so riveting seeing a different point of view. So I was wondering, what made you decide to go that route?
Yeah, that's a great question and not one that anybody's asked me so far. That's really deliberate, and it has a lot to do with the time that the book takes place and when and how Gil arrives in Miami. He's very, very young. And in his early life, when he's chasing this experience of like, he really wants to be a rock star, like that is the thing that he's chasing from the beginning. And you see this in subtle ways, and you may not have gotten this far yet, but throughout the book, there are a lot of sort of subtle insinuations of like, this is not for you. Like, this is not for you. You're not supposed to, like, you are not rock star material, and the fact that you were a person of color is part of that. And so him, I think, burying that part of his identity early on is an attempt to sort of be more palatable to a certain kind of consumer base. Part of what comes into it, and I don't know how far you've gotten in the book, I'm trying to spoil things. Another thing that comes in later in the book is his wife is not a person of color, and her family really doesn't love that. And throughout the book, Suzanne's grandmother is kind of constantly complaining about how much she looks like her dad. And there is this subtle strain of racism in all of those moments that is really difficult for him and later difficult for her because she feels so cut off from this whole part of her culture that she's just been missing her whole life. But later in the book, after her parents have split and they're kind of building new lives for themselves, Gil does re-access that part of his heritage in a way that is not kind of shame-coded. And a lot of it has to do with encountering other people in his own environment who he can kind of share that with. And Suzanne finds herself sort of craving that too. And as I was writing this book, because so much of it is about America and traveling around this country, and that was a really tough thing to do with one of the timelines being set in 2018. And that was a major thing I had to think about when I was revising the book, because when I originally wrote it in 2016, we hadn't yet lived through a Trump America. Mm-hmm. And so as I was rewriting this from the top down in 2023, I had to think a lot about, okay, a road trip across Donald Trump's America is very, very different. How does that feel and what does that look like? And Gil was already the character that he was, but that was something that I was kind of like, okay, that's a thing that we're going to need to contend with in some kind of a way. And it's heartbreaking that there is this pressure for people who come here from other places to try to look as much like your kind of bog standard white people as possible and to act that way as well. And that is especially difficult for anybody who's a public figure. And that was something that I did not want to back away from. So you do see these moments of microaggressions with other people in his bands and his family. So yeah, I wanted to give him a chance, but not, I wanted to give him a chance to have the thing that he wants, but not make it easy, because it wouldn't have been.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Reading that from like a different standpoint of view from where I come from, it was such an eye-opener in like a whole different sense, where like this other side of immigrants don't really like appreciate their culture the way I was taught to. So it was really cool reading that. Yeah.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
Appreciate that. Yeah.
So throughout the book, there's amazing descriptions of the music, like very specific, the songs. And I mean the performances, but also you have the lyrics. And I'm wondering, like, are there actual songs? Did you write music for Gil and the Kills?
Oh, I wish I had that talent. Sadly, like the musical bug did not bite me, which is such a shame, because it does exist in my family. This maybe explains a lot about me, but my paternal grandfather was a Frank Sinatra impersonator in Las Vegas for much of my childhood. He sang Mac the Knife at my parents' wedding, which is such a weird choice for a wedding. There's footage of this. It's something. Everybody in the room is like, what is happening right now? He was great. But I'm a performance studies scholar at heart, and I really love writing about live performance and reading live performance. And that was something that I found was kind of missing from a lot of the books about music that I was reading. And it wasn't something that I wanted to leave out, because my favorite place in the world to be still is in the crowd at a really killer rock show.
Well, sometimes it was frustrating not to be able to look up the actual like discography on Wikipedia.
Oh, I know.
Because it felt so real.
Oh, I'd love to hear that. Thank you.
The performances, just the building, the drama. Yeah, it was very, very compelling.
Well, thank you. Well, what I will tell you about the lyrics, because I did have to write lyrics for entire songs, because the music industry is very, very stingy about letting you reprint lyrics. For a fun thought experiment, there was a version of this book where they did a cover of Like a Virgin that was... I'm sad to this day that I had to cut that, but we never would have gotten away with it. So I had to write my own songs instead. And that was daunting. It was challenging because I'm not a poet, and all of my attempts to write poetry have been very embarrassing. And so how I approached that was the way I approach everything, which was research. When I was thinking about what kind of a song is this, because an 8-minute power ballad is really different from like a 2-minute pop hit. So I would start from a place of what are these songs about? What kind of a song is it? What's the genre? Build a playlist of things that I felt like were similar to how I wanted the song to feel. And then looking really closely at like, how does the structure of the song work with the structure of the lyrics? What are the themes there? And then the other part of it was, these are characters writing these songs, not me. So it's this funny little act of ventriloquism where I'm writing a song, but I'm writing a song as Gil or as Vince, two very different people. So for instance, in all of Gil's songs, there's a lot of Catholic dogma that comes up because he does come from a Catholic background. And that's something he and I share. So that was a little bit closer to the surface. But that was something that I was thinking about very intentionally, was what kind of a song would this person write? And I spoke to a lot of the songwriters I know about how they write songs, just to sort of get a sense for like, how do the real ones do this? And one of them told me it takes him an average of 10 years to write a song. And I was like, what does that mean? And he said, some songs, it takes me 20 years to get them right. And I tweak them and I tweak them and I tweak them until I feel like they're there. And then some songs come into my head in 5 minutes, fully formed like Athena from the mind of Zeus. And that was weirdly comforting to hear, because I had a similar experience of, there are some songs in this book that I wrote the first versions of all the way back in 2016 and then kind of wrestled with them for an entire decade until I felt like they were right. And then there were other songs, after I'd been doing it for a while and I was getting a little better at it, some songs that did just kind of pop into my head in an instant that even had tunes to go with them. Like one was Minnie's Place. That was a really late addition because I just suddenly like sat bolt upright and emailed my editor at like 2 a.m. to be like, I think Gil and the Kills need a drinking song. And I have one because I know many of those. And that was just like close to the surface and very easy. Handful was another one that had a tune that went with it. So maybe someday I can persuade one of my musical friends into like actually writing music for this, but we'll see if that's in the budget down the line.
Brand extension. I'm thinking brand extension the whole time you've been talking about this.
Well, we've got the merch. We just need to cast the band now, right?
Wax the band, yeah.
So mine's kind of like a word vomit one. So
I love some word vomit. It's very on theme.
So please bear with me because it's kind of like a half-formed question. So we were kind of talking about the book beforehand. And one of the things with this, so I just read Giovanni's Room for the first time.
Oh, wow.
Like earlier this year. And I feel like for me, Hot Wax kind of follows that same kind of narrative pattern where it's like, you know, when you start the book that something happened, something monumental happened to Suzanne on this tour. And just like the journey there, when you get to that moment, it like felt like a two-parter for me. Just kind of like the moment in the room, and then like obviously she doesn't know what happened with the after with Gil.
Oh, no
like,
spoilers, please, because a lot of people
I know. That's why I'm trying to like be subtle about
yeah.
it. But it's like, were any of those sections that you had to rework that you mentioned, did it have to do with that, you know, that denouement in that?
Actually, no.
Okay.
That moment, excuse me, that moment was crystal clear in my head from the beginning.
Okay.
Yeah. And I knew from the beginning that I absolutely had to get that right, because if I didn't, the whole thing would fall apart.
Yeah.
It was the trickiest work that I did in this book, and I remember very vividly writing the first draft of it. I was in a rental house somewhere, and I was in Las Cruces, New Mexico, and it was hotter than hell outside, which was actually kind of perfect for what I was working on. But every single word in that scene is very, very deliberate. Okay. And part of the reason I actually knew that my editor was the right person to work on this book, of all the different people that we talked to, most of whom just wanted to make it more like villains, and I was like, not the right person to work on this book. But when I was speaking to Tim about it, one of the first things he said to me was, that scene is extraordinary, don't change anything.
Yeah.
And the fact that he understood what that scene was and what it was trying to do, I was like, this is the person that I want to trust with this, because you can't change anything about that in the way that it happens, I think.
Yeah.
So that is a piece of writing that I actually am very proud of, which is not
You
something
should
I
be.
can say about much. Yeah.
I think that like getting to the point, because I'd spent the whole book being like, what actually
Yeah.
went down, and then just like when I first read it, it felt like it was so, maybe not subtle's the right word, but it felt like it turned everything on its head that had led up to that moment. And so it made me like go back and question everything. And I think, like you mentioned, you're such a writing is so good in this book.
Oh, thank you.
And so I just like, I don't know, I think this was a really, that scene just like floored me for the rest of the book. And I was like, okay, now I have to reread it.
Oh,
It's just
thank
like,
you.
it was really good. And so I think you did very, very well with it. No spoilers, but it's a really good book. For
Thank
those
you.
who haven't finished it yet.
That's a spoiler. It's a good book.
Yeah. No, it's just like, it was so like, I sat there and I just like felt the color drain from my face because I was like, this is actually happening. Like, it just was so, and it just kind of made how Suzanne is as an adult. It made, everything kind of clicked into place. And I was like, holy shit, this is such a well-crafted book. And it's
Oh,
so
thank
tragic.
you.
And we were also saying, like, you make very well-rounded characters. Like, even like the secondary characters who are only in it for a few scenes, like Vince, there's just you, like, especially female characters. Like, I feel like we don't really get very well-crafted characters, and I feel like, especially with this one, because this is like the first one that you read where like the main character is a woman, and it's pretty much the only narrative besides Rob. We don't care about him, but like
The Normie from Hill was called him last week.
yeah. And so it's just like, I don't know. So like, thank you for this book. It was like really good. That's
Oh,
what I'm
thank
gonna say
you.
about that. Okay.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. And I think the word subtle is actually a very good one to use for that, because one thing I was very conscious of with that chapter is it would have been so easy to overdo it. It would have been so easy to overdo it, and it would have been so much less real.
Yeah.
So yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. And to your point about the women, yeah. Another thing I really didn't want to do with this book was to cut women out of it, because being a woman in the rock scene is hard.
Vince was badass. I loved her.
Yeah, thank you. That's a little bit of a spoiler, but oh well. Yeah, I was very determined to not do what always happens in the music industry, which is where women get sidelined, or it's made very clear to you that you are only welcome here in a very specific capacity.
Yeah.
And that has not been the reality that I've witnessed in the music business. There are women everywhere who are doing a lot of the heavy lifting and getting none of the credit. And it is a tough environment still to be female in.
Yeah.
It's still kind of a hyper-masculine environment. People have said insane things to me as working as a journalist in this business, especially because my email footer is my pen name, which is gender neutral.
Yeah.
And so I will talk to a lot of people on email, and the tone is very, very different from when I show up and they realize that I'm a relatively young woman. And it's like there's this instant shift.
Yeah.
And I have to think very carefully about how to play that moment.
Yeah.
So yeah, that was another thing that I didn't want to shy away from. That was something I wanted to rather like shine a light on.
Yeah.
So I appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Here, and then there. I'll popcorn around a little bit.
I kind of have like a two-parter question, but I'll make it like quick. So, I'm a Shakespeare studies person. Yay.
Makes two of us.
Okay. I kind of, you mentioned you were an actor and you've acted before, and with If We Were Villains and with this one, performance is a big aspect. So I just wanted to ask, like, when you write books, like, what is it about performance that is so interesting to you to write about, that you like to get in, like, that you like feel like it's important to focus on, or like what is it about performance that you keep coming back to when you write?
Yeah. I actually have a really quick, easy answer for that. Well, I don't know how quick it'll be. But easy answer, which is live performance is a uniquely embodied medium. It is the only kind of entertainment that we have where there is no separation between the person making the art and the person receiving it. Even when you're writing a book, it's like a very intimate thing. Like anytime you read a book that I've written, it's kind of like you've gotten inside my brain and poked around a little bit. But something like we're doing right now, or like something you see in live theater or at a rock show, that is like the purest kind of artistic connection that you can possibly get. And it is sort of undeniably visceral when you have bodies in a room. And that is, I think, one of the reasons that I'm drawn to performance and writing about performance is I'm also very interested in like the human body as a semiotic object, how bodies interact with each other, the effect that one body can have on another, whether it's a gesture or it's an expression or it's something totally nonverbal, non-communicative. I think that really gets to the core of who and what we are in an increasingly digital age. I think we tend to forget that we're essentially just like walking meat suits. And we like, Descartes can come along with this whole, like, I think that therefore I am, and the body and the mind are totally separate. And dear God, could that not be more wrong? It's a nice idea, but it just ain't true. And like, ask anyone who's struggled with their mental health, like the way that impacts your body and vice versa. Like, these things are not separate at all. And I think fiction can get really heady, especially a certain kind of literary fiction that's very interior. And there's certainly a time and a place for that. It's just not my style. I much prefer to write fiction that you feel like you can climb inside and live there. And that's all about sensory experience. I'm very much a method writer. I like to get as close to the thing as possible. So one thing I did while I was working on this book, which I can't believe we haven't talked about this yet. When I was rewriting this book from the top down, I actually went and lived out of my car for 18 months because I wanted to really get this right. And I felt like writing a book about living on the road, that was kind of the only way to do that. And similarly, a rock show, and this is part of the reason I was so determined to do those live scenes, sort of no holds barred, it's not just the sound. It's not just about the sound. It's also about the spectacle. It's about the costumes. It's about the lights. It's about the smell. It's about the cigarettes and the fog machine and 25,000 people spilling beer on the floor and somebody smoking weed in that corner over there, and you can definitely smell it. And what does it feel like to have like 500 sweaty people jumping around you in a mosh pit? That's the most alive I've ever felt in my life. And we don't think about fiction as being electric in that same kind of way, but I don't think there's any reason it can't be. So anytime I'm writing anything, I always start from a place of all five senses, not just what does it feel like on an emotional level, but what does it feel like physically? What's the texture of this place? A lot of early readers called this book sweaty, and I was like, yeah, you get it. This book is kind of gross. I'm going to warn you. Like, it gets very violent, it gets very bloody, it gets very grimy and gritty and dirty, and I think that to write a book about rock and roll in any other way would have been really dishonest, because my experience of being on the road with a traveling band or even just being backstage is like, yeah, it's kind of grimy. Everybody's sweaty. Nobody's had a shower in 4 days. You're sleeping like 5 to a room in the most terrifying motel you've ever seen. And I think that to glamorize it over much, it would have felt really wrong. So yeah, I have a lot of reasons for being interested in performance, but that's just like a few of them. Yeah. I saw a hand over here maybe. Yeah, and then we'll come back over here. So and then I don't want to bore you guys to death. We've got a few more minutes.
So I only just got my hands on it, so I haven't read any of it yet. But from your perspective as the author, is there anything for like a first-time reader that you would want someone to keep in mind while reading it, or like specifically like search out or anything other than like don't compare it to villains?
I mean, here's the thing. It's not like totally a departure from villains, although a couple of people have used that word. There are some things that I think will be very familiar to readers of villains. It's a book about performance. It is also a book about big, messy character dynamics, because I'm an ensemble writer. I get bored writing about just one person, and I like, for me, the character dynamic kind of is the main character. So that I think will be familiar, and hopefully will be kind of scratch that itch a little bit for people who really loved villains. But there's two things. There's one fun thing and one kind of deeper thing. The fun thing is, there's a lot of music baked into the text. The characters are constantly talking about music. All of the chapter titles, most of the chapter titles are song titles. Look that stuff up. Go listen to it. That's a little Easter egg for me about like, this is kind of what this chapter might sound like. And a lot of it, if any of my past events have been any indication, will be music that you maybe haven't heard before. Like, does anybody in this room know Dead Moon? Hey, there's one. I love it. Yeah, Dead Moon is one of my favorite bands that you've probably never heard of. And ditto, like, I talk about the Gun Club, and that's another one that hardly anyone has ever heard of, and it's such a shame because they were incredible. And because the way we all listen to music now is streaming, and the algorithm has totally screwed up how you find anything, this is a whole new way to do that. So I really hope that this will kind of turn people on to some new old music, if you will. The other thing I will say about it is a long book. And the first half is much slower than the second half, and that's kind of by design. So don't rush yourself and sip it slowly until it feels like you can't anymore, because it is a bit of a slow burn for the first half, but trust that when things go off the rails, they will really go off the rails. I saw a few hands over here. Yeah.
When you were on the road working on writing this, are there any particular places that you visited that were memorable?
Oh man, so many, and you'll see a lot of them in the book. But the thing that I've been talking about the most is, because I never planned to put this in the book, it just kind of happened. One thing I got really interested in and obsessed with while I was working on this book was ghost towns. I love the Southwest. I love the desert Southwest, partly because we spent so much time driving out to Vegas when I was a kid. But there are, and ghost towns are really not what you think they are. You have the kind of tourist trappy, like Terralinguas and Tombstones, and those places are fun too, but it's really more like a theme park now than anything else. When I say ghost town, I mean places that are like 19 miles on a dirt road and nobody lives there anymore. Because it's such an interesting slice of history that many people don't think about anymore. And I just had this really fascinating question of like when, and this is a question that Suzanne asks in the book, is when does a town die off? Who decides that a town can't be saved? And then what about the people who still live there? Because a lot of ghost towns are still inhabited by, 20, 30 people who are living in trailers and very protective of their space. I got shot at once. That was exciting. Got chased off property a couple of times, once by a dog. Texas is a fun place. So yeah, that was a thing that just like, I could not have predicted that was going to be part of the book until I actually kind of like went out and lived it. So yeah, that was maybe my favorite thing that I discovered in the process of writing this book. You already got to ask one, so I'm going to make you wait. Yeah, back here, and then we'll come back over here, and then you, and then we probably have to stop so people can get home.
What's your relationship like with danger? Like, do you feel like it guides your work? Or is writing offer a spaciousness that you might not have otherwise?
That's a great question. I love that question. I have never had a good sense of self-preservation. Never. I was in the emergency room constantly as a kid. I was constantly injured. Part of the reason I never became a guitar player was I couldn't stop breaking my fingers long enough to actually like get decent at it. Yeah, and I've been reckoning with how much violence happens in my fiction and where that comes from. And some of it comes from, I am just interested in bodies, and I do a lot of work on bodies in my academic research. But maybe not so much anymore, again, talking about Donald Trump's America, we live very safe lives, generally. The most danger that most people are going to be in on a regular basis is getting behind the wheel of a car, right? And I think there is something lacking for us in the fact that our lives are so safe and so boring. I think there's a reason that we crave things like football is a blood sport in tights, which is why I love it. But there's a reason that we watch boxing. There's a reason that we watch football. There's a reason that people play contact sports. My dad's joke is that I have lived life like a contact sport. But yeah, there is something about that I think there is a kind of primal drive for a certain kind of competition. And we're really the top of the heap. We don't have natural predators except each other, which is sort of a dark thought. Another thing that's interesting to know is that Homo sapiens were not the only species of human on the planet. We systematically exterminated all the other ones. And that's why we're, kind of the apex predator on the planet, and we're slowly destroying it, but not so slowly anymore maybe. But I do think there is something sort of inherently human about that craving for danger. Like, why do we get on roller coasters? Why do we get on roller coasters? Why do we go to rock shows where it feels like, it's that kind of really alive, pulse-pounding, adrenal velocity sort of experience? So yeah, I think fiction is a way to explore that. I was going to say a safe way to explore that, but I've definitely done some physical and psychological damage to myself in the course of writing books, probably because I'm a little more method than most people are. But yeah, I don't know. I've always been a bit of an adrenaline junkie. I am that person who will wait an extra 20 minutes to be in the front row of the roller coaster. So there's something there. I don't know what it says about me. It's probably nothing good. But I think as long as you can examine those impulses from a place of, philosophical inquiry and not from an unthinking place of, I just want to do violence, I think that's maybe productive. We live in an increasingly violent world, and I think if we spent some time thinking critically about it, that would maybe be good. Great question. Yeah.
So shortly before Hot Wax came out, there was, of course, a news story that broke about a Jumbotron and a Coldplay concert that I'm sure
Yes.
everyone recalls. And as you posted on your Instagram, and I will say this without spoilers.
Yeah, this is not a major spoiler. This is fine.
There is a stunningly similar event that takes place in the book. I wonder if you could talk about that experience of seeing something that happened that you had already written about play out in a different way, but
Yeah.
and
So-
also just kind of more generally about like the role of being seen or being watched in the book.
Yeah. So for those of you who somehow missed this, like I'm happy for you that you're that unplugged from the internet. But so a thing happened at a Coldplay concert where a couple of people were on the Jumbotron getting very, very snuggly with each other, and then they immediately got very freaked out. And it came out later that this was the CEO of some major company and an employee that he was having an affair with. And they got caught on the Jumbotron. He lost his job and probably his marriage, and it was a whole mess. And I lost my mind when this happened because there is a very similar moment in Hot Wax that happens with people who get caught on a Jumbotron. And like, it's a different moment because it doesn't end that way. But I was like, people are going to think that I based this on the Coldplay thing, which I absolutely didn't because I wrote this like years ago. But this kind of stuff happens all the time. Like, life imitates art and vice versa. It's a chicken or the egg sort of question. And yeah, I mean, like the idea of a Jumbotron, and in the book, it's actually a kiss cam, which is the worst thing ever invented. Like, that should be illegal.
But that was a kiss cam too, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Was it? Was it also a kiss
Kiss
cam?
cam.
I thought it was just the Jumbotron.
No,
No, yeah.
kiss
Looked like
cam.
a couple. He had his arms around it.
Yeah.
Oh, no kiss. Let's put the camera on it.
Yeah, and like anybody who's like been on a kiss cam with someone who is not someone they want to kiss, like that happened to me once at a game where the person I was sitting next to was my brother, and I was like, no, absolutely not. And that always that happens, and I put that moment in there because I wrote, spoiler alert, I wrote a scene that takes place at the rodeo. And I went to the rodeo a couple of times for research, and I was floored that they had a kiss cam at the rodeo. I was like, really? And I was like, that's just too weird not to use. So yeah, I put that in there. But there is also a lot in this book about voyeurism and kind of spying on people, really, particularly with Suzanne. And there is this sort of question of, when you become a public figure, how much of your privacy do you forfeit? And how much of a say do you have in that? Similarly, when you become a partner to someone, how much of your privacy do you forfeit? What kind of information is your partner entitled to? And who gets to make that decision? That, I think, is an increasingly important question in the age of social media and the age of parasocial relationships and a lot of boundary crossing that happens with that. I am so grateful every damn day that I am a writer, because people don't really care about writers for the most part, and God, is that refreshing. To 99% of the population, I am absolutely invisible, and I love that. A lot of the musicians that I work with, they don't have that luxury. They get recognized on the street. It's this like constant interruption, this expectation of like, oh, can we take a photo? And there's very little thought for like, maybe this person doesn't want to be in that persona right now. And there is also just this expectation to live our entire lives online. And that's increasingly true for anybody who is trying to make it in an entertainment industry, including publishing. I wish that being on Instagram was not part of my damn job, which is probably why there's a chapter in this book called fucking Instagram. It's my editor's favorite chapter in the book, actually. But when you write anything that sort of interrogates this question of fame and chasing fame, there is a lot of stuff that goes along with that is actually really not a whole lot of fun. So that was another thing that I was kind of like, yeah, this is a part of the life that is way less glamorous than you might think. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, great question. Thank you. Do we have time for one more?
Sure, one more.
Great. One more. You've had your hand up for a while.
So I'm a rambler, so this is going to be a very, very badly worded question. But so I haven't read the book at all. I just bought it like right before this.
Going in cold. I love it.
So I know that you were talking about earlier, it's a very polarizing book. And at least from what I've gathered from some of people's questions, it's some very, very intense moments.
Yeah.
So I was kind of curious about the process that you go about when you're deciding, I want to approach this topic and talk about it while still being kind of like, I think it like especially with polarizing content, you're kind of walking that fine line of doing it justice versus going overboard and kind of contributing to the problem.
Sensationalizing, yeah.
Yeah. So I was just kind of curious about how you try and respect that, especially if it's something that you haven't gone through personally.
That's a great question. You guys are asking great questions tonight. You make my job so easy. Maybe it wouldn't be easy if I didn't like answering questions on the spot, but had some practice. I was a teacher for a long time. So what I will say is that that's a thing that happens in the revision process mostly. When it comes to representing things, part of the reason I'm a method writer is I don't like to write about things that I don't have some close contact with, because there is inevitably the danger of doing it wrong. But the alternative is to only ever write about your own lived experience, and that would be boring. And that's also why for many, many years publishing has suffered for diversity, is because it's been much easier for people who are like cishet white people to get published. We have a bulk of stories about cishet white people. You can write about other experiences if you take the time to do the research, and you certainly have to be open to the fact that you're going to get things wrong, but you do owe it to your readers to get it as much right as possible. And for me, whether that means, writing about queer people when you're not a queer person, or writing about, a place that you've never lived, or whatever it is, you owe it to yourself and to your readers to do the research to get as close to the thing as you possibly can. Whether that means going and doing location research, or that means interviewing people who have the lived experience that you don't. Hiring sensitivity readers who can speak to how you're representing things and if you're doing it well, or if you're doing things that might be hurtful without even realizing it. So there is that responsibility when you're going to put anything out in the world for public consumption, and it's one that I take very seriously. I would never claim that I'm doing it perfectly, but I do really try to not do anything horrible. The flip side of that, though, is we've also gotten to a place with fiction where sometimes people expect trigger warnings for a book, and they want to know every possible upsetting thing that they could encounter. And that's hard as an artist, because that really limits what you can do with a novel. And sometimes the reason to depict something upsetting is to critique it. The point is that it's upsetting. And the books that have meant the most to me in my life have been books that are about very upsetting things or contain very upsetting things. I don't go into fiction going, I'm going to write about some really upsetting stuff and then see if I can do that well. My first and foremost priority is always to tell a good story. That's where I start. And just because I've never been interested in writing stuff that's really PG and sanitized, you end up writing about difficult stuff, and you write a book about the 80s rock scene, you cannot make that shit PG. You cannot do it. It would be such a lie. And I knew that going into this. I knew that this was going to be a very, very R-rated book, which could be a hard sell for some of my readers of Villains, which is very comfortably PG-13. But that's where the revision process really comes in, is you get that story down on paper, and that's, at least for me, where I do the really delicate work of, are we doing this right? Are we doing this well? Are we doing this in such a way that is justified by the narrative and not in a way that it feels like it's there for shock value? And that's another thing that actually comes up as a theme in the book, is what are we doing on stage, and is it for shock value? Because you can't get into the entertainment business without kind of confronting that question. So personally, I never write anything for the sake of shock value. Sometimes I write about things that are shocking, but there's always a reason for that. And as long as I think you as the writer are being intentional about that, that's your job. If that makes sense.
Lovely. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.